I want to welcome you to the 17th Hans Maeder Lecture at the New School. I'm Will Milberg. I'm the Dean of the New School for Social Research, and we're very pleased to have Professor Roy Brooks with us today. Redressing Slavery, Competing Perspectives will be the talk. I wanted to say a word about Hans Maeder so that we all know why this wonderful lecture series exists, and then introduce Darrick Hamilton, who will be the moderator. Hans Maeder Lecture was established in honor of Hans Maeder, who was really an extraordinary intellectual and political activist who exemplified in his life's work a dedication to international understanding and social justice. He was born in 1909 in Germany, fled in 1933, a year we know well at the NSSR. He eventually got out of Europe and landed in the US in 1941 and quickly became an educator in the United States. In 1945, he joined the faculty at the Walden School in New York City. And then in 1948, he founded what was called the Stockbridge School, a nonprofit prep school, which he and his wife opened in 1949. It was considered a progressive private boarding school in New England. And Maeder declared that the school would be interracial, non-denominational, and international. And it was a progressive boarding school with a diverse student body under the flag of the UN. And along with its director, in the 1950s, the Stockbridge School attracted the attention of the McCarthy Committee, as well as progressives in support around the world. He became well known in United Nations circles and in US international education circles, and both Dag Hammarskjöld and Willy Brandt considered Hans Maeder a friend. After his death in 1988, his former students endowed the lectureship in 1990 at the New School. And we're very pleased that it is really one of our most distinguished lectureships, and it has featured such scholars as Jane Mansbridge, Jürgen Habermas, Gordon Brown, Joschka Fischer, Dan Kahneman, Danielle Allen, Timothy Garton-Ash, Kimberly Crenshaw, and today we add to that distinguished list Professor Roy Brooks, the Warren Distinguished Professor of Law at the University of San Diego. The moderator today will be our own colleague, Darrick Hamilton, the Henry Cohen Professor of Economics and Urban Policy at the Milano School and at the Department of Economics at the New School for Social Research in New York. Darrick is the immediate past president of the National Economic Association and a principal investigator of the National Assets Scorecard in Communities of Color project. He is a stratification economist who has published widely on a variety of very relevant topics given today's lecture, including the causes and consequences of racial and ethnic inequality, wealth inequality, most importantly. His PhD is from the University of North Carolina. He is a regular and very highly sought both media commentator and policy advisor. I am honored to have Darrick as a colleague, and I am very pleased to welcome him today to introduce our Maeder lecturer. Darrick.
Thank you, Dean Milberg. It is a pleasure to be back at the New School and a pleasure to introduce and moderate this lecture. And without further ado, let me give the introduction so that we can get to the lecture. Professor Roy Brooks is the Warren Distinguished Professor of Law at the University of San Diego School of Law. Professor Brooks teaches and writes in the area of civil procedures, civil rights, jurisprudence, international human rights, and critical theory. He is the author of more than 110 articles and more than 20 books, including The Racial Glass Ceiling, Subordination in American Law and Culture, Integration or Separation, A Strategy for Racial Equality, Racial Justice in the Age of Obama, Atonement and Forgiveness, A New Model for Black Reparations, The Law of Discrimination, Cases and Perspectives, and his new book, Diversity, Judgments. Professor Brooks is clearly prolific, to say the least. Not only is he using, but moreover, not only is he using his considerable intellectual efforts and talents to generate new knowledge, he is producing that knowledge in a way that promotes a more moral and inclusive society. in my view, what more important endeavor can an academic do than not only create new knowledge, but to lead to a better world? So without further ado, please, Mr. Brooks, Professor Brooks, deliver the lecture.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Hamilton, and thank you, Dean Milberg and the committee for this invitation. I look forward to spending some time with you thinking through an important and complex issue. And I will go for about maybe 25 minutes to leave some time for questions and answers. So my plan is to outline the contours of competing approaches or strategies for redressing slavery and the lingering effects of slavery. These approaches have yet to find expression in the public discourse on slave redress, or what is commonly referred to as reparations. So to that extent, I would argue that the public discourse on redress is rather under-theorized and perhaps incomplete. So let me begin with a short history of the movement for slave redress as sort of a backdrop to my lecture. The movement for redressing slavery is not a movement of recent vintage. It has deep historical roots in our country. Claims for redress were in fact made at the end of the Revolutionary War and throughout the antebellum period. And at the end of the Civil War, ex-slaves sought redress from Congress, and in fact, an ex-slave pension bill was sponsored by Lincoln's party, the so-called radical Republicans, but of course it went nowhere fast. Some ex-slaves even approached their former masters seeking payment for services rendered. In the decades following slavery, each generation of African Americans has reasserted the claim for redress against the federal government, standing in the shoes of parents, grandparents, and their parents and grandparents. Over the years, Black leaders as diverse as Marcus Garvey, a racial separatist, and Martin Luther King, a racial integrationist, have called for slave redress. So too have former President Obama and also former Secretary of State Colin Powell. Today, more than 75% of African Americans support slave redress. Bills in both houses of Congress have been introduced by African American politicians, political leaders, with some support from whites, calling for the establishment of a committee to study the redress question, similar to a committee that was established for the redress of the internment of Japanese Americans during the Second World War. Support for slave redress has come from major corporations, including Bank of America, Aetna Life Insurance Company, the Hartford Courant, which is the leading newspaper in Connecticut. Georgetown University is among several institutions that have sought to atone for participating in the institution of slavery, the peculiar institution as it is called. So the claim for slave redress is not a claim advanced for the first time some 155 years after the fact. And it is a claim that enjoys broad support among African Americans, as well as support among many white Americans. Now, white support, in my view, is based in large part on recent public events, which underscore a point that African Americans have made for a long time, and that is that Black and white Americans are not similarly situated. They are not at equal risk in our society, some 155 years after slavery. White Americans can see this in the public execution of George Floyd, performed with excruciating deliberation and nonchalance by a white police officer who was unafraid of being videotaped. Then there is the white woman in New York's Central Park who weaponized her white privilege by calling the police on a Black male who simply wanted her to restrain her dog as required by law. Though she did not consider herself to be a racist, she knew exactly what to say to get the police to come out. That such a system into which she could tap exists in our society today speaks to the critical question of race some 155 years after slavery. So though slavery ended more than 150 years ago, two immense wrongs have outlived the institution of slavery. The first is racism, which was used to justify an economic system of human bondage and exploitation. This psychology of slavery, that is to say racism, is still with us today. The second is the socioeconomic conditions of slavery. In other words, the capital deficiencies that exist in African-American society today, financial, human, and social capital deficiencies. So the point I'm making here is that the lingering effects of slavery can be understood in terms of the psychology of slavery, i.e. racism, and the socioeconomics of slavery. And that the call for redress must be understood within this context. Can't be understood in a vacuum. This is the context in which the redress claim is being made. But responding to this call for redress is not a simple matter. There are competing approaches to redress that must be considered before the matter can be brought into the political arena. One approach is called the tort model, and the other approach is called the atonement model. The tort model primarily seeks victim compensation and sometimes punishment. Though largely adjudicatory, the tort model can be pursued through legislation wherein the emphasis is on victim compensation. For example, Florida passed what is called the Rosewood Compensation Act of 1994 to compensate property damage caused by a race riot in 1923, in which the Black town of Rosewood, Florida was basically obliterated from the map of Florida. In contrast to the tort model, the atonement model focuses less on the victim than on the perpetrator, less on the victim than on the perpetrator. The atonement model seeks to establish conditions necessary for moral clarity and the prospect of repairing a broken relationship between the perpetrator and victims of an atrocity. So under the atonement model, the victim seeks a genuine apology from the perpetrator, first and foremost, and then calculates the sincerity of the apology by the weight of the reparations. So if the reparations are sufficient, the perpetrator reclaims its moral character in the aftermath of the atrocity, and the victim forgives and moves forward with the perpetrator into a new, healthier relationship. This notion of forgiveness is a point of contention among reparative scholars, and maybe that's something that we can talk about in the Q&A. But if the reparations are insufficient to make the apology believable, it's all about making the apology believable. One of the books I wrote is titled "When Saying Sorry Is Not Enough." This is a situation where saying sorry is not enough. So if you need the reparations to make the apology believable, but if the reparations are insufficient to make the apology believable, there is no redemption, there is no forgiveness, and consequently no repair of a broken relationship between the perpetrator and victims. In other words, no reconciliation. So under the atonement model, a reparation has a special ontology. It is the revelation and realization of an apology. So a reparation transforms the rhetoric of apology into a meaningful material reality. So the tort model and the atonement model make different normative claims. The tort model is backward-looking, victim-focused, and compensatory or even punitive. It seeks basically compensatory justice. No apology, no forgiveness, ergo no reconciliation. The atonement model is forward-looking, perpetrator-focused, and restorative. It seeks restorative justice. In other words, it seeks to restore a broken relationship between the perpetrator and the victim. And it also seeks to give the victim an opportunity to restore its moral character in the aftermath of the atrocity. One other thing to note about the tort model and the atonement model is that they use reparations at both the individual and institutional or community levels. Individual reparations are called compensatory reparations, which is not too important for our purposes, but in contrast, institutional or community reparations are referred to as rehabilitative reparations. The important thing is to understand that reparations can be at the individual and institutional level. Much of the talk is about reparations at the individual level. And also note that reparations at either the institutional or individual level can be in the form of cash payments, which is what we hear a lot about, or non-cash payments, such as services or new laws or better enforcement of existing laws. Now, the tort model and the atonement model intersect with a larger framework, and these are the post-civil rights theories, The post-civil rights theories represent core beliefs or norms about the best way to maximize racial progress in our post-civil rights, post-Jim Crow society. And there are basically 4 post-civil rights theories, and these theories, I'm going to go through them quickly in the book, Racial Justice in the Age of Obama, which was published in 2009, I believe, by Princeton University Press. There's a whole book devoted to these post-civil rights theories. The first theory is traditionalism, which advances the colorblind or racial omission norm. The second theory is reformism, which pushes racial integration, which is certainly in conflict with the racial omission, or colorblind norm, as in the case of affirmative action programs. The third post-civil rights theory is critical race theory, the theory that President Trump doesn't like. And critical race theory basically argues that social transformation, deconstructing white hegemony, is the best path to racial justice going forward. And finally, limited separation, which is not total separation a la Marcus Garvey. Limited separation argues that racial solidarity or identity is the best way out of the racial abyss, that the best place to find a helping hand is at the end of your own arms. Again, these theories express core commitments or strategies for racial progress going forward. And the point I wish to make here is this, that the question of whether the nation should proceed under the tort model or the atonement model intersects with a larger question, namely, what is the best way to maximize racial progress going forward? The redress question, the tort model versus the atonement model, has to be determined in a manner that is consistent with our collective strategy for achieving racial justice in this post-Jim Crow period. Always there are any number of ways, always there are any number of solutions for any given problem of social justice. So President Obama's strategy for racial progress is different from Justice Clarence Thomas's strategy for racial progress. Critical race theory is different from limited separation. And so what I want to do is to invite you to think about how these frameworks intersect. And let me give you a few suggestions, and these are only suggestions, okay? There's a sort of an invitation to think, to dance. The first post-civil rights strategy is traditionalism, whose central tenet is race neutrality is the best way for best strategy for pursuing racial equality in our post-civil rights society. Not only for African Americans, but also for whites and society as a whole. And most of the members of the Supreme Court are certainly traditionalists. Traditionalism's commitment to racial neutrality suggests redress in the form of a government apology, but no government reparations at either the institutional or individual levels. Voluntary private reparations are fine, that's acceptable, but the government must remain neutral as to matters of race so as not to impede racial progress. That's the argument there. The second theory is reformism, which holds that racial integration across the board is the best way to achieve racial equality in today's society. Reformism's commitment to the racial integration norm suggests full atonement, specifically a government apology and reparations at both the individual and institutional levels. At the institutional level, the reparations would perhaps consist of reforms across the board in education, in employment, in housing, in voting, health, police, and across the board. In education, for example, reformists would perhaps want a constitutional pre-commitment for racially integrated public schools and colleges, implemented through a regime of racial preferences. Individual reparations would perhaps consist of direct cash payments as supplemental income. No strings attached, no strings attached. Third is critical race theory, which holds that social transformation is the only way to achieve racial equity. The issue here is not equality, but equity. So we have to fundamentally change the relationship between race and power in our society. We have to deconstruct and reconstruct white hegemony. So critical race theory seeks not just reforms, but social transformation. I look at critical race theory as reformism on steroids. So critical race theory sort of suggests full atonement, specifically a government apology plus reparations at both the institutional and individual levels. Institutional level reparations might consist of systemic restructuring in education, employment, in housing, and voting, health, police, and across the board. In education, for example, just to stay in the education lane so for purposes of comparison, these changes might include a constitutional pre-commitment for racially integrated public schools and colleges implemented through a regime of racial quotas to ensure social transformation. Individual level reparations would perhaps consist of cash reparations distributed on a conditional basis for purposes of wealth accumulation. So the funds would be restricted to such items as home mortgages and business investment. There is obviously tension between these, the cash payments that would come from reformism and the conditional payments that would come from critical race theory. There's a question of agency. Should African Americans be told what to do with their money? So there's a great deal of tension there that needs to be worked out. Finally, limited separation argues that racial solidarity or racial identity is the only way to move forward. That whites in position of power, what Darrick Bell used to refer to as white elites, are more self-interested, more transactional than racist. Yes, there are racists out there, but the problem is really with those whites who are afraid and who are self-interested. So limited separation, again, is not racial exclusion. So white students, in fact, attend historically Black colleges and universities. It's no more exclusionary than Smith College is for women. But so you have whites in attendance at these institutions, at historically Black colleges and universities, at Black churches, at other limited separatist institutions, but one must understand, limited separatists argue, that our main mission is to tend to the special needs of African Americans, of the Black community. Studies have shown that identity improves educational outcomes. So limited separatists would probably ask for a regime of reparations, institutional reparations across the board. But these would go to Black institutions, okay? So they would first and foremost want to make sure that Black institutions are up and running and are functional. And then they would also want, in the context of education, again, to stay within that lane, they would also want to make sure that there is a constitutional pre-commitment, a constitutional amendment that would recognize the legality of Black institutions, publicly funded Black institutions. so that's basically the, sort of the frameworks and how they intersect. And I think what I want to do is to stop here so that we can have some time for a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Brooks. That was comprehensive understanding of both the theories and approaches to achieving racial inclusion. I'm going to lead off with a question around application. Are there any lessons to learn from perhaps other countries or our past as to different approaches that ones have taken, particularly as they relate to tort versus atonement? I'm thinking of the South African Truth and Reconciliation, and then even Australia and how they address truth and reconciliation with Aborigines. So let me stop talking and hear your response.
Yeah, no, and this influences me. I can tell you that when I first got into this, and I started this about maybe 30 years ago, and it was through the invitation of a publisher. I just finished a book, and the publisher approached me and asked me if I would do a book on reparations. And I said, no. I said, that slavery is in the past, and I'm about the future. I don't want to do that. And it was a waste of my time. But then the publisher put me in touch with a comfort woman. I said, a what? A comfort woman. And these are women who, as young as 12 years old, were pressed into sexual slavery by the Japanese Imperial Army during the Second World War. And so I got to know the comfort woman very well. And I also worked with the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I'm dating myself, during the whole question of redress, moving South Africa from apartheid to a society of democratic rule and racial justice. So it is influenced by that. And I've given lots of lectures around the world, and I've got to meet wonderful activists and government officials and other scholars, reparative scholars. And the one thing I've learned from South Africa in particular is that individual reparations, that is to say, direct cash payments, they really don't work. I've talked with attorneys there that represented victims who received cash payments, and a year later they were broke. Okay, so that influences me. I'm not a fan of cash reparations unless they are conditional as opposed to direct. In other words, they're used for a specific purpose and they are controlled by an atonement trust fund. And I'm mainly a fan of rehabilitative reparations, that's the institutional reparations. Yeah, and I think we can learn from those experiences there that you have to be very careful, especially with cash reparations, because there's a problem that we call predatory inclusion, where you have individuals who will surround and also institutions, friends, families, and insurance companies that will come to you and say, hey, look, you're receiving these reparation payments. Let me show you what you can do with this money, okay? So yes, South Africa has influenced my thinking on this, and also the comfort women, the Holocaust. Yeah, this is all, so the quick answer to your question is that I'm a big fan of the atonement model, not the tort model, because of these historical experiences.
And by the way, for the rest of the audience, please start submitting questions in chat, and I'll try to get to them. But I'm going to push a little more about the cash payment versus other forms. Seems like in the conversation around reparations or redress, there are lots of dichotomies, and those dichotomies could have some overlap. There's the question of institutional versus individual compensation, atonement versus tort. And, of course, one could even push and ask the question, can you actually get atonement without tort? There is, and I'm going to say a bunch of things and then give you an opportunity to respond to.
Go ahead.
There is the question of, is there even a responsibility to the victims? If there is, what is the responsibility of victims if indeed reparations are comprehensively done in a way that does the truth and reconciliation and the appropriate redress? What burdens, if any, do victims have, or what responsibilities, perhaps is a better word? So what question do I want to ask? Oh, I want to say one other thing. All right, so even in thinking about cash payments, we know that the harms that have been committed in the past, part of the problems with the harms is that they generate a political and economic devaluation. And in an economic sense, from my economic training and thinking about North-South trade models, you can stimulate a South economy and lead to greater inequality, in part because in trading, the Southern economy does not own the means of production. So they end up and turn around and trade with the North economy, and the North economy generates a multiplier effect where they generate even greater economic gain from the stimulus. So in the American context, Black people would be vulnerable both politically and economically, even if you gave them cash payments. So, you know, thinking about that, I don't have a question. I just said a bunch of things. Any responses?
Yeah, no, I see several questions in there, you know, and let me address two of them. One calls into question the viability of compensatory reparations, that is to say individual cash payments. And again, I think that the best way to handle that is through conditional cash payments that are targeted for the wealth accumulation. And so that you can't take the money and just go on a trip to Las Vegas or to South Africa for cultural awareness. Again, that you run into the problem of agency there. I understand that, but I think that the problem of reparations is really not so much for African Americans to get rich. You know, if you look at it from the Atonement Model, it's really about the onus is on the perpetrator to repair an atrocity that it is responsible for, an atrocity committed against an innocent people. So what I like about the Atonement Model, which you don't get with the tort model, is that the onus is placed on the perpetrator as opposed to the victims, okay? But the victims do, and this gets to the second question I think that I see in your commentary, and that is, what responsibility does the victim have in all of this? And this is very controversial, but under the Atonement Model, which is the only model that places a responsibility on the victim, there is the responsibility to forgive. And this is only though it's conditional, okay? It's conditional only after there has been atonement. That is to say, an apology, a genuine apology with sufficient reparations that the victim can agree to. So this is happening over a period of time, okay? It's not gonna happen overnight. That's the one thing. People think that reparations is going to happen in one day, and it's not. This is a protracted problem. But the victim's responsibility to forgive is a civic responsibility. In my view, it is not a moral imperative or moral prerogative, unlike the perpetrator who has a moral duty to atone for an atrocity. And all of this is necessary if we are going to get past the problem of slavery and the lingering effects. It doesn't mean that we're going to stop having to have civil rights laws. We're still going to need that, but at least we can deal with this atrocity. And as I said, we have these two lingering effects from the atrocity. And if racial reconciliation is what we are trying to get at, then it seems to me that the victim does have a responsibility.
Yeah, and you know, I want to point out, and you pointed this out in your talk as well, that in this moment, a great deal of respect should go to social movements and that have made this politically relevant to the point that it has today. I mean, during the DNC primary, it was almost the case that HR 40 was part of the party platform. Many of them, if not all, signed on to at least the bill to study the appropriateness of reparations and how it could, if be implemented. And, you know, another shout out to Representative John Conyers, who's passed away, for steadfastly bringing it to Congress year after year. So here's a question from the audience. How do individual/institutionalized reparations differently advance abolition and decolonization? Question mark.
Abolition, decolonization, abolition of what? Not of slavery. I don't think, you know, I would want some clarification on the question when they say abolition, decolonization. What the reparations are designed to do, whether we are talking about the tort model or the atonement model, is designed to it's designed to repair some of the lingering effects of slavery, in particular, the capital deficiencies within the African-American community, the financial capital deficiencies with, you know, with income and property, human capital deficiencies with, you know, involving education and skills. So to that extent, it moves us forward. You know, the question also brings to my mind the fact that, or at least I won't say it's a fact, there's a debate as to whether or not we are calling for basically a transitional justice here, as in South Africa, a total remaking of our system. Certainly critical race theory is calling for that, not reformism. Critical race theory wants a total restructuring. They say, look, we are in a situation that calls for transactional justice, similar to South Africa, although South Africa has not really achieved the transitional justice that it wanted. It got political, but not economic restructuring. And so critical race theory would certainly call for this wholesale, deep restructuring of our society. But that's just one strategy, and it's a strategy that needs to be debated against the other strategies.
So another question that came up in the chat is the question of identification. So, you know, I'm sure you've heard this before, and this has been queried to you. If we were to implement a reparations program, how would you identify who would be eligible in the United States? And, you know, I'll ask the other controversial question that comes up in these conversations. Would Blacks who immigrated post-slavery be eligible? You and I both have heard them. Let's hear your response.
Yeah, that is it. And see, again, if you look at this argues in favor of actually limited separation, because their reparations are rehabilitative. That is to say, they go to Black organizations. So the question of who, you know, there's some discussion outside of that, but I want to give you the sort of an analysis which I think could clarify that whole issue, these kinds of issues. What the limited separatists would say, the institutions sort of the victims the beneficiaries are self-defining, because the money goes to the institutions. For example, there is something called UPI loans in Arizona. And this is a Black organization that provides loans to small Black businesses which are not able to qualify for regular SBA loans. And so the people that come there are going to be the beneficiaries of the reparations ultimately. And historically Black colleges and universities, there are whites there. Yeah, okay, so, you know, there are whites there, but the reparations are in large part benefiting African Americans. So if you keep the reparations at the institutional or community level, you don't have to get into the questions of who the beneficiaries are, okay? Because you are focusing on institutions, and the people who populate these institutions are, by definition, the beneficiaries. If you go to individual reparations, then you get into these questions, and Sandy Darrick and other economists have worked out that even my old law professor, Boris Bicker, who wrote the book, The Case for Black Reparations, it was published in 1973. I was at Yale Law School at that time when the book was published. He has a way of making that determination. So there are formulas out there for determining how you identify the beneficiaries of any reparative program.
Yeah, no, to add on, race is a social construct and it has social meaning, and we have very good ways of identifying who was defined under that social construct historically as Black or white. So I'm with you in that that's not an insurmountable hurdle and one that we're quite capable of identifying. I guess, some of your answers lead me to another dichotomy that, again, doesn't have to be a dichotomy that has overlap. And that's the question of retrospective versus prospective. If an ultimate goal is economic inclusion, and maybe there's more to the goal than just economic inclusion beyond identity. Reparations, people juxtapose policies today and make the argument in case that, I do a lot of work with baby bonds. I'm one of the architects of that policy, which is aimed at setting trust funds for every child in a way that is progressively endowed based on wealth position, which is intended to be anti-racist given the dramatic racial wealth gap. And some people have said, that's reparations, and I reject that claim. It's not reparations. I support reparations, and that's not reparations. There are other policies as well. So Elizabeth Warren, with some of her proposals to address the harms of redlining, which I applaud, but again, in my view, that's not reparations. And others may call it reparations. So the question I'm getting at is, can we address this with, if we were to ever to have a racial egalitarian society, do we need both retrospective and prospective policies? Yes or no, and elaborate, please.
Yes, we do. And I'll give you a very specific example. And in a post-atonement America, we are still going to need civil rights laws. Laws which prohibit discrimination in education and employment, what have you. And the constitutional pre-commitment for affirmative action would be an exception to these laws, okay? And so reparations, atonement, it is based upon what happened in the past, but also the lingering effects into today and also in the future. And these reparations are necessarily asymmetrical measures. You can call them civil rights measures if you want, okay? We will still need to have regular civil rights laws, which are symmetrical civil rights measures if you want. So white Americans can sue under our civil rights laws, but they are not entitled to reparations, okay? Japanese Americans can sue under our civil rights laws, but they are not entitled to reparations for slave redress. No more than African Americans are entitled to reparations for Japanese internment during the Second World War, okay? So, I mean, that's the thinking that I have here, and it's sort of inclusive, but with an understanding that redress, slave redress, serves a very specific purpose. And if you look at it from the atonement perspective, it is designed to get the government which has been in existence since 1787 Constitution, to atone for its past atrocities and to try to repair the damage. You just can't say, well, from this day forward, we're going to have colorblind laws. You got to do something about the damage that has accumulated over the years.
Yeah, thank you. Another question is about strategies to achieve reparations. The questioner asks, what is the resistance to implementing the reparation system? And then two, what are some strategies that can get us to overcome that resistance?
Well, it depends on, if you look at the limited separatists, they would say the main impediment is sort of white self-interest, They're saying, yeah, there's racism out there, but whites are basically self-interested, just like anyone else. And so that's the sort of thing. And there's a lot of fear. And actually, in the Atonement book, in the preface, I spend some time talking about these impediments and how to get over it. The fear, the sense that, and I'm around a lot of people who are conservative, and with their fear is that if there's too much restructuring in the society, then whites are going to be on the bottom. That's their fear, and but what we have to do is we have to focus on good social policy. What is good for our society? That's the way you get over this. Okay, the focus has to be on social good. What is good for our society? So reparations, it's not just something that's going to benefit African Americans. It's going to benefit society as a whole, because we're making our society a more virtuous society, a more equal society. We know the benefits of diversity. We see that all the time. There was a report that just came out yesterday that said that movies make more money with a diverse cast. Okay, so we know the benefits of diversity, and so there are benefits to reparations or slave redress, and these benefits go to the public good, and that's the focus. It has to be on the public good.
Yeah, I mean, one of the arguments I've made with regards to the Truth and Reconciliation is that it produces a pushback on the narrative that poverty is the result of deficit attitudes and behaviors, which is often racialized. It's often framed in deadbeat dads, welfare queens, but it spills over onto white people as well. White poor people are defined somehow as other. I'm not the first to say this, the term white trash has come up. So a benefit from Truth and Reconciliation, an authentic analysis of why we have haves and have-nots in America, particularly along racial lines, would be that it would frame inequality squarely where it belongs, which is a historical and contemporary system of resource deprivation, which affects our ability to have policies when we have a global pandemic. In the face of that pandemic are essential workers and Black people who have a higher mortality rate. Maybe we'll have a different type of public response. So yeah. Let me, if you want to respond, otherwise I'll read it.
I'll take another one.
Okay, so here's one. You mentioned that there is a psychological component and socioeconomic component to redressing slavery. It seems like not all of the frameworks you cover touch on the psychological and socioeconomic aspects equally. For example, does the traditional model not address the psychological aspect of redressing slavery to the extent that it does not address the hegemony of whiteness in the way that critical race theory does?
Well, it depends upon your perspective. Critical race theorists would do exactly what the questioner is suggesting needs to be done. But there are others like the reformists and who believe that, no, we don't want, all we need to do is just kind of tinker, around the edges. We don't need this kind of deep structural reform. Okay, we don't need, whereas, but again, what the critical race theorists are saying, look, what we have to do is lift up the hood so that we can see what's going on, and we can see the various ways in which this society subordinates groups. Okay, and you can bring in intersectional analysis we want, but the argument there, their basic argument is that what we have to do is we can't just do reform. We have to lift up the hood. And to see what's going on there and to do some restructuring, okay? And when I talk about the psychology of slavery, what I am talking about is racism. That is to say, how is it that racism, that these racial mindsets exist today, 155 years after slavery? I mean, that's a telltale sign that slavery has a presence in today's society. That's what I'm talking about.
Okay, so we got about less than 5 minutes. We got 4 minutes. I'm gonna queue up one more question, and then I'm also gonna invite the dean if wants to come in and say any remaining remarks, and then give you time to have any concluding remarks as well. So here's one question. What do you make of the argument that it is precisely the impossibility of reparations i.e. the possibility of repairing the ontological violence of slavery that makes the demand politically mobilizing. That is precisely in the impossibility of the demand that it's a revolutionary potential. And I need to get my eyes checked. And I can't read the last word, sorry.
Okay, I got the gist of that. And this goes to what a civil rights theorist is all about. And if you look at abolitionism, okay, the theory that slavery ought to be abolished, that claim had to be made, even though it was not politically possible or feasible for that to happen. So, and at the end of the Revolutionary War, you had to make that claim, okay? During Jim Crow, you have the civil rights lawyers arguing for equal rights, even though Jim Crow was the law of the land and it was not politically feasible. As a matter of fact, it took the Supreme Court to overturn Jim Crow, okay? So you have to have, as a civil rights theorist, such as a Frederick Douglass or Martin Luther King, you have to make the argument, okay? And what you do is, in a way, it's sort of utopian, not political, it's utopian. And this is what civil rights theory is, at least in the initial stages, okay? So what you want to do is to point society in the right direction. And this doesn't mean that you're going to be a space cadet. What it means is that you are going to look at the empirical, provide empirical analysis, and then you are going to have a prescription which is within the reach of morally motivated individuals and institutions. That's what abolitionism was, that's what equal rights was, and this is what reparations is. It doesn't have to be politically feasible now. Doesn't even have to be economically feasible now. We have to have the concept down. And this is what I'm saying. What we have to do today is clarify the concept, and then we work on it, okay? Asking us to be politically feasible now, to be economically viable now, is unfair and ahistorical.
Well said, Will.
Beautiful. I want to thank both you, Professor Brooks, and you, Professor Hamilton. I mean, you've done just what we hoped, which is the New School for Social Research, you know, really prides itself on trying to kind of deconstruct kind of common social categories and re-theorize them. And you've done that for us. You've done just what we want by theorizing, bringing out the atonement, tort distinction, sending us off in a way that's going to make us rethink, I think, some of the premises of what we've brought to that discussion on reparations. So, I mean, just thank you so much. Really grateful on behalf of the whole New School community. I want to add one note as we hit 1 o'clock, which is that the Maeder lecture is famous not just for the lecture, but for an incredibly great dinner that we hold afterwards. And it's not just great food, but also fantastic discussion with our faculty and our community. And we're not going to get that today. And so I want to extend an invitation when you are next in New York City and we are able to do such a thing. I want both you, Professor Brooks, and you, Professor Hamilton, to promise that you'll join us for continuation of the discussion and a good dinner.
Absolutely.
So thank you both. And
we will hold you in debt for that dinner. Thank you, Professor Brooks.
Thank you so much, and thank you everybody for attending today's lecture. Take care.
Cheers.
Great job, Darrick. Really great. Thank you.
I appreciate it.
It's really interesting.
Yeah, no, conversation goes so quick. We could obviously go on and on and on.
Yeah, I mean, but it's probably Zoom calls shouldn't go that much more than an hour. It's best to kind of quit while you're ahead.
I think you're right.
All right, I'll see you soon. Thank you again.
Right.
Really great.
Thanks.